what's going on. I want to make the quick argument that we actually don't really understand what technology is, but more importantly, we don't know what technology does. Because I think we're actually having a crisis of truth, we're having a crisis of values, and a crisis of willful ignorance. This is an existential crisis, but it's based on human foundations, not based on technology. But there's a lot of hope that comes as a result of technology. So I'm going to explore a little bit about that for a couple of minutes before we dive into the broader discussion. So, how are we making machines learn? How are we making them intelligent? Well, let's start with us as humans. How do we learn? How do we become? Or how do we define intelligence? Well, it starts with inputs. For us, those are our senses, the things that we see, the things that we hear, touch, taste, smell. And they flood our brains with all of this information, of which that we slowly and start to build categories for. And we build these categories by identifying the patterns that exist within that flood of information. Those categories are things like chairs, the things that you sit on. And from there, what we do is we start to build relationships with those categories. Our minds start to fuse these ideas together, like chairs and tables, like conference rooms, like presenters, like fear of making mistakes in front of your most senior colleagues in a global organization. But then what we do, and I think what's something that's uniquely human, is we start to store these categories and these relationships in our minds, and we're able to reflect upon them. We can start to think about what they mean to us. And meaning is something that's very human. And following that, we can respond. What are the things that we do in response to that? So how are we taking this approach in the way in which we teach machines how to learn? Machine learning is something that we've heard about a couple of times today. I'm going to try to do a quick explanation, because obviously there's a lot of depth in behind this. At a very high level, all machine learning is it's using mathematics and statistics to figure out how a system works for a given outcome. So when we think about a chair as that outcome, what we're doing is we're asking a machine, without telling it what the legs and the seat and the back of a chair is, to figure out what a chair is based on all the inputs that we give it. Or another example in our world is the Amazon referrals that we get at the bottom of the page when we're looking to buy a book. So what Amazon has done is they've said, we want to sell you another book. That is the outcome. And machine, can you please evaluate the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of people that come?
There are two huge shadows that ought to be on everyone's mind, in the background at least, whatever the immediate issues are. For the first time in the history of the human species, we're facing the possibility, indeed the likelihood, of destroying the possibilities for decent human life. One of these shadows has been there since 1945. It's nuclear war, and it's kind of a miracle. It's never happened. There's another one which we don't know what can be done about it, or if anything can be done, and that's environmental crisis. The groups that are in the forefront of trying to do something about it are the what we call the uncivilized societies, the Aboriginal societies, First Nations, the tribal societies. They're way in front. I remember one of my earliest childhood memories is riding in a trolley car with my mother somewhere, and we passed a textile plant where there were women on strike outside and police brutally beating them, which was standard. The U.S. has a very violent labor history. I mean, workers being murdered on the job into the late 30s. And it's all of these are childhood memories, and also just discussions about everything. You know, a lot of these, my own family, uncles, aunts, and so on, and many of them barely went to school, a couple of years of elementary school, but It was a very educated population, and incidentally, that's traditional. If you go back to the British and American working classes in the 19th century, they were self-educated, but highly educated. Take the main issue on the front pages every day now, what to do about the deficit.
Sure.
Okay, just drove in this morning, listened to the liberal public radio station, NPR, big discussion about what to do. All take for granted we just got to do something about the deficit. That's actually, the public doesn't think so. The public regards the deficit as a minor problem. They regard the main problem as joblessness. And in fact, the deficit contributes to getting jobs. It's good for jobs. You can read that in the business press. It creates demand. And business isn't investing because they don't want to bother, so only government spending can create demand. So the public thinks, yeah, let's get after the jobs. Now, they're not alone. Like, the business press agrees with them, but not policy. So right now there's a new project by, there's an organization called ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. One of their new projects is to get states to introduce into the educational programs, children's educational programs, what they call balanced teaching about the climate. That's a code word for climate change denial. Other groups, the religious groups, try to do the same thing with creationism. You have to have balanced teaching, evolution science and creation science, and there's a whole rubric of critical thinking, and it's total nonsense. But the idea is to try to really make it a stupid country.
Right.
That's very important for business, because they want to make short-term profits. They don't care what happens 20 years from now. About 70% of the population has absolutely no influence on policy. They're disenfranchised, totally. The lowest 70% on the income wealth scale, they might as well not bother voting, and most of them don't. As you move up the wealth income scale, you get a little more influence. When you get to the very top, which is a tiny group, they essentially get what they want. That's very remote from democracy. I'm pretty conservative. Like, I was very involved with the activist groups in the 60s and since, and young kids, so I had to listen to plenty of rock music and smell funny smells, which I didn't recognize, and things. And I kind of endured it, but it wasn't part of me. Fortunately for us, my wife and I, our own kids liked to listen to Joan Baez and Joni Mitchell and so on. That was fine.
So you're okay with just influencing the music? You don't have to listen to it?
As long as I don't have to listen to it. I can listen up till about, late Stravinsky, and then I kind of tail off.
Yeah, fair enough.